Warning: the radio broadcast you're about to hear was made by men and for men. It may at times seem a little rough around the edges, brash, and certainly not canonically approved by papal authority. But its content may indeed challenge you to become the man, father, husband God has called you to be. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to another week of The Obligation. My name is Jason Murphy. So glad you're here. We have an exciting guest coming back, someone who is no stranger to The Obligation, Father Colin Blatchford. Father Colin is the Associate Director of Courage International in Trumbull, Connecticut. Courage is an approved apostolate of the Catholic Church that counsels men and women with same-sex attractions in living chaste lives in fellowship, truth, and love. Courage members are men and women who experience same-sex attractions and who have made a commitment to strive for chastity. They're inspired by the gospel call to holiness and the Catholic Church's beautiful teachings about the goodness and inherent purpose of human sexuality. Through Courage, people who experience same-sex attraction receive pastoral support in the form of spiritual guidance, community prayer support, and fellowship. The last time Father Colin Blatchford and I were together, we were doing the Share-a-thon, the Sacred Heart Share-a-thon for the Carolina Catholic Media Network. We had a great conversation that day, and we discussed Pride Month and the origins and the Catholic Church's perspective, kind of opinion of Pride Month and where all that all came from. And we also had a wonderful blessing of the reversal of Roe versus Wade that same very day. So, Father Blatchford, I appreciate you coming back. How are you doing today?
Doing very well. Thank you, Jason. We just had our annual Courage Conference a couple weeks ago in
That's right.
Chicago. Good turnout, a lot of good speakers. So I'm just kind of coming off the high of that, and getting back into the, I guess, the doldrums of summer, the last few weeks before we get into that, that fall setting.
That's right. Yeah, it definitely does become that. We're just talking about that the other day. We had the kids home. They're probably getting a little bored. Parents getting a little agitated. We went and did a little fishing, and I think the water's got some of the doldrums in it because it's just so stagnant and hot this time of year. The fish really aren't biting, so it's just all things are pointing to the fall and kind of some refreshing of that spirit. But so I guess tell us, I've been following along a little bit from the post of Courage, but tell us a little bit about the conference.
So every year, Courage has put on an annual conference, roughly since their inception. 43 years ago, 42 years ago. And they pick a subject that's applicable to members of Courage and Encourage. We've done a couple of conferences where, we'll have a track for parents who are seeking to maintain those relationships with their child who's in the lifestyle, is same-sex attracted, experiences same-sex attractions, or has gender identity discordance. And we've had tracks for them. Here's how sometimes this stuff develops. There's no answer to all these things to say, oh, this is the one thing, but there are things that we know as far as working with people that they can kind of keep an eye out for, and things that people are seeking. And so usually we do that, or we pick a subject matter. This year we picked our second goal, the second goal of Courage, which I'll butcher it right now, but it's to live a good spiritual life through spiritual reading, prayer, spiritual direction, frequent attendance at the sacraments of Mass and the Holy Eucharist. And so this year we did it on the interior life. So it began with a talk on a keynote on the spirituality of St. Francis de Sales, who's the patron. Our original founder, Father John Harvey, was an oblate of St. Francis de Sales, and very much St. Francis de Sales' spirituality inculcated the beginnings of Courage, which his spirituality is very much focused around bathing everything in charity, patience, forbearance. So this idea of being the gauntlet of steel and velvet, right? Very clear in the truth, but soft enough to bring them in. And that's how he converted the city of Geneva in Switzerland. And so anyway, that was the keynote. But then every other talk after that was about how to find a good spiritual director, how to receive spiritual direction, how to pray, Lectio Divina.
I saw that was one of your talks, right?
Yeah, that was the talk I did. So it was about building up the spiritual life this year. So we always do something like that where we can come together for fellowship, but also deepen our faith.
So that was opened by Bishop Condola of Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, he's been a great friend of Courage. Yeah. Well, he wasn't the keynote. It was Canon Matthew Tellerico from the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign Priest.
Oh, interesting.
They're a traditional religious order. We had originally asked the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales to do so, Father Daly of Oblates of St. Francis de Sales fame, right? But he was unable, and so St. Francis de Sales is one of their primary patrons after the Immaculate Conception. And so we asked them to do it. A beautiful talk, wonderful talk. Those will all be up on our website, by the way. I don't know, September-ish, something like that.
Excellent.
If people wish to see them.
So that was you had different tracks that were, I guess, open to the public, but was it primarily for the ministers and the clergy of Courage?
No, we always have a day at the beginning of the conference. So the conference is Thursday through Sunday, and the Wednesday before, we always have what we call a clergy study day. We do anthropology. So a good way to think about it is when you and I communicate ourselves to each other, right? Like we're hanging out and let's say having a cigar and a whiskey or something, right? The way that we communicate to each other is through stories or narratives, right? Right. I don't say, well, I got up yesterday at 6:30 and then wait 5 minutes, literally, and say, and then 5 minutes I got up, right? Like I don't give you every moment of every day. That's super boring. Stories, we want to pick out the most important things, so show the associations and figure out the correlations between cause and effect. That's actually how our brains function. And our perception is wired in such a way that we care about what the cause and the effect are, the value of it. So why is the chocolate cake important to me? It's not because it's the object chocolate cake, but because of the cause and effect, like the emotions that it brings up and the memories and how it makes me feel. And so our perception is value oriented. So the reason I say all that is because we'll start with them by saying like, hey, we communicate through stories. Perception is value based. When you're talking to somebody and they're going to be communicating in a narrative, and your brain is actually going to fire as if you were in that narrative looking for those values. Because we're men, that's kind of how we.
Well, I guess our Lord knew what he was doing with teaching through parables, then for sure.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's totally true. And so it's important for us then to understand the story of how God created man, and more importantly, for this particular subject, the proposed place in that story for sexual pleasure, right? Right. And so when we understand then where sexual pleasure fits within the story, then we can begin to show to somebody who Christ is within the context of the story and where sexual pleasure is proposed to be, rather than just giving them moral consequences. Well, that's a mortal sin, right? like that doesn't help as much as, here's the beauty of why God created it in the way that he created it. Right. And he says that if you really want happiness, this is how you have to do it. Yeah. So if you really want happiness, then we'll do it. But this is how it has to be done. Right? Now, I'll sit here in the mess with you. I'll sit here in the struggle and help with trying to figure out how those things go together, because that's what we're here for.
That makes a lot of sense.
So sorry. So we do that, and then we talk about the pastoral things. That's the second part. Then we get we talk to the priests about the pastoral approaches, proper pastoral approaches. So part of it is we're there to be a compass. We're not there to fix anybody. We're not mechanics. Nobody fixes people, right? Except for God, by means of grace, and they have to cooperate with it. And so talking about, look, you don't have to change them. They don't. If they're really concerned with a particular identity, that's okay. We want people to integrate in a healthy way their thoughts, feelings, and desires as related to their sexuality and their identity according to reason and the revelation of God. Well, that healthy and harmonious way does not happen overnight, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm sure you and I, right? Like, I don't know how old you are, but I assume you're about my age. So you're a little younger than me, I think. We
I'm
had this
48. I
conversation.
don't know. I think I'm up
Oh
there
no,
with you.
you're like 10 years older than me. Okay, never mind. Like
Yeah.
we're still working on this stuff, right? You as a married man, me as a celibate man, we're still working on this integration. This stuff doesn't ever end, especially for men. Like, we're probably dead for 10 minutes before it ends, where we actually have it integrated because we have no blood flowing through us anymore. Like, that's okay. That struggle will go on forever. What's not okay is taking delight in it, right? Like, and that's what Francis de Sales talks about in the stages of temptation: suggestion, delight, and consent. If we can avoid the delight and the consent, then there's no sin there. And it could be a temptation to heterosexual or opposite sex attractions, I should say, or same sex attractions, or whatever, right? Disordered attachment to food, like whatever it is, those can always be integrated, and we should integrate them and work on integrating.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of different groups, just in the time that I've gotten to know you and learn about courage. I've looked around, and there's a couple other ministries, and I guess not trying to say one's better or the other, because I don't know enough about any of them, but there's a couple others. I just want to kind of get your opinion of where those stand, because someone perhaps trying to live a good chaste life according to the gospel, according to the way our Lord wants us all to live, goes online, maybe struggling with same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria, and a couple of results pop up. And so I just want to get, from your perspective, someone who is obviously very integrated, in touch with that area, what can we, there's two others I just wanted to mention, and then you can maybe kind of distinguish. So there's one that is called New Ways Ministry. Are you familiar with that one?
Yeah.
And then I think it's Outreach. Is that Father Martin's?
Sure.
So out of the, so if you could, just for our own edification, just kind of, what and maybe some distinctions between those, if that's a fair question.
Sure. No, that's fine. It's a fair question. I would hesitate to just go through and like list things. We can talk about those in particular. But I would say that importantly, if you go to Pastoral Care of Homosexual Persons, written by the USCCB, the original I think was 1986, but there's an updated one now for 2006. And I can't remember the title off the top of my head. But they outline, the one in 2006 in particular, they outline what it is that we're looking for in pastoral care for those who have same-sex attraction or gender identity discordance. And in each of those, it says that the proper type of pastoral outreach is one that clearly upholds the church's teaching on homosexuality, I would add, and gender identity discordance, and seeks to meet the person where they are and bring them to that integration. Not bring them in the sense of we're going to change you, but in the sense of we're here to help you live out chastity. So if chastity is not a part of it, then that's a problem, right? Like, right. And what does chastity look like? Well, obviously there's a part of chastity that's not having sex, right? Like, okay, that's a very big, that's not really chastity, but like that's meant to be the start of it, right? Okay, so we could say they're at least being continent in sexual acts. Okay, that's a beginning part. Then there's a part of it in which the person, the group actually has to speak of chastity in terms of like integration of sexuality within the person. And so what you see is there are only a handful of groups. Courage is the only one that was mentioned specifically by the Vatican in those documents. But Eden Invitation is a good group. They're similar to Courage. They're not an offshoot of Courage. They started independently by these two young ladies, but it's very sort of like millennial, and is it Gen Z after the millennials? whichever one we're in. Like the kids in college now, it's very much oriented
right.
towards
right.
that present generation in college and high school right now.
Okay.
Maybe those who have just graduated college. That's kind of where they are. That's their focus. But like they ascribe to the same things Courage does. They use our resources on their website. They have that same vision. Mary Hassan has something called the Person and Identity Project. So they work primarily with people that have gender identity discordance or their family members, their loved ones, in helping to maintain those relationships. Yet again, right, like we're seeing this consistency with church teaching. So the problem with that we encounter in like new ways and outreach is that there's either a clear statement that people don't have to live the virtues that and according to the moral law that is required by everybody, right? Usually the implied premise is, well, because God made me this way. And if God made me this way, then he didn't make me to do something that he's going to disallow me, because that would be contradictory. So that's not right. But then again, if he made me this way, then like there's another species of person who the moral law doesn't apply to. But I don't know. So it becomes very convoluted. Anyway, basically, it's affirmed that this is acceptable behavior, or it's incredibly ambiguous. And so, like, for instance, in the spiritual friendship movement and some of the speakers for outreach, you get this sort of, they would never say that one doesn't have to be chaste, but they also wouldn't say that one has to be chaste, right? And so there's this idea of like, you know, the chaste same-sex partner, we live in the same house and share the same room, but we just don't have sex. And it's like, well,
yeah,
you know, like what is that? I mean,
the alcoholic sitting at the bar, you know?
Yeah. I mean, now that doesn't mean that people can't live in community. We have a number of members, Courage members, who live in community, men and women. Sure. There's usually a third person involved, first of all, right? Because it's a lot easier when you have a third person, exactly, keeping you accountable. And they're prudent. They're very open with each other about that particular temptation, and they let them know very clearly. And that's just how they, and that kind of vulnerability builds a beautiful friendship, right? That isn't allowed to be taken advantage of by vice, because they have this other person as well. So anyway.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that makes sense. I was going through, I guess they had a synodal survey, I guess through New Ways. And I just browsing through, I kind of get that same sense of what you're speaking of, kind of not necessarily coming right out and being real clear about the goal of, of chastity. And just some of the points here, some of their core commitments. I mean, just reading one of them, like becoming anti-racist in our programming, publications, and internal operations, as if we're inherently going to be racist in the first place. Like I don't think anyone who's striving, and working and living in a Christian life is going to inherently, be racist. I don't know. I feel like it's playing into some of the political kind of political correctness and, quote unquote wokeness that I think is penetrating so many organizations. But I mean, I didn't go too deep into that, but just kind of looking through, I kind of get that sense. But I just wanted to, kind of have some distinction, between the different organizations that are out there, because I think there is a lot of confusion. If the faithful, are kind of confused, and like I mentioned the last time we talked, that conversations such as this and going into some of the details of same-sex attractions and gender dysphoria, it's kind of taboo. It's just something, especially I think with the issues the Catholic Church has had, and been overly publicized. Over the past several years, 10 years, with clerical abuse and things like that. I think the faithful are just really gun shy to enter into conversations or really, want to venture down that path in many respects. But it's such an important thing, because I think, and I've been talking a lot, obviously, I've been hitting a lot about the crisis in the church, and looking back in the 1960s and what's going on, with the liturgy and, some doctrinal positions of the church, as we've progressed, to where we are today. And I mean, I find the common denominator. I made a comparison last week. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it. There's a documentary on Amazon. It's called Uncle Tom. and it is from a Black conservative position, which tends to be, just kind of looked down upon, especially from society, and thus the name Uncle Tom. Kind of a turncoat, someone who is not faithful to their race, and nothing more could be further from the truth. And as you watch this documentary, it really lays out, the 1960s and the welfare state and this sense of victimhood that was kind of portrayed towards the Black individuals in our country. And prior to all of that coming into place, the Blacks were doing very well. A lot of their own businesses, they had some of the highest marriage rates. And now, of course, we know that they're suffering and been affected greatly by that. And so this group who put this out, I think Larry Elder, who's a conservative talk show host and author, and Dr. Ben Carlson and Candace Owens, some very reputable and intelligent folks making this argument. And I started looking at it because I've been looking at it, so long with from the Catholic perspective, and looking at the 1960s. And the common denominator on all of this is an attack on the family, and that's kind of how I wanted to breach this kind of conversation. Is that we see because many in the church will say, well, there was a sexual revolution, and that's why people that's what affected families. And we look at maybe this welfare state that was kind of created, and this poverty, this war on poverty, kind of self-inflicted. But ultimately, I think we can agree that it all stems from attack on the family, the domestic church. I mean, the infancy of it all comes from the family. If the family is destroyed, the church is destroyed, and Satan knows that. And I think all of this that we're seeing, this just, how popular the LGBTQ, idea has just evolved. I mean, would you not agree that this kind of, we can't say it's not a science that we know for a fact, but looking at all this, is not the underlying principle here an attack on the family? Would you say?
Oh, for sure, absolutely, right. It goes back to. I would say it actually goes back to an attack, even more essentially on woman. But yeah, the family is the smallest unit of society. It's where God, it's where God created us to first learn to love what God's love is like. Male and female, he created them. So the complementarity, the procreativity, the permanence, the fidelity in marriage, absolutely. As marriage goes, so goes the world, because, people talk about politics and culture, but that's all downstream of the family.
Yeah.
Which is downstream of the marriage, right? So if mom and dad aren't living the marriage the way they're supposed to, and they're not living the fullness of that complementarity, making sure that, they're upholding the dignity of each other, well, they're not going to do it with their kids, and then their kids aren't going to do it in the world, and then the world's not going to do it as they go to lead the world. And
all these factors have the same, they all do the same exact, they all have the same effect, and in many different ways. The welfare state, has, blown up families. This idea of the sexual revolution, trying to affect, the family, the central family unit, and they all kind of, just stemming from there. And I guess just like anywhere, if you look, ultimately, any sort of disorder, really is going to come from, it's not 100%, there's always going to be, there's examples, of course, where there was, perhaps perfectly healthy families, and the child was affected, maybe not something directly from the family, but, something exterior impressed upon, or maybe there was abuse, or so many other factors. But would you say that a common denominator in those with a same-sex attraction, or in the other disorders, have that? Would they coming from a broken home, or a home with abuse? Would you say that that's a pretty fair statement, that most would stem from that situation?
I would hesitate to say most come from a broken home.
Okay.
Now, I would say that there are. They all have relationships from formative periods in their life where they were wounded, in that sense. But does that mean it's a broken home? Not necessarily, right? I'm thinking of like one of my siblings that, my parents, like, as they communicated love to him, he didn't receive it in the way they communicated it. Very different personality that they had not had. He's very melancholic. Neither of them are that way. And so they had to rethink how they did it. And it took them a while, to really think about how to communicate that in a way that they could receive in the words they use so that there wasn't wounding, Yeah. I mean, that's a part of being a parent, but like, what if the perception from that was, well, I was never really loved by my parents, right? Like, obviously that's not accurate. Like, he was fed, he was clothed, he was, surrounded by siblings, and they did the best they could. But, what if a parent didn't even have that on their radar because less education, more jobs and work, and they weren't around, all sorts of different things. So I would hesitate to say broken home. Because I don't think that's true. Because there's plenty of parents that are coming to me who are homeschooling parents who have taught their kids the faith, who have really loved them, who are not overly strict. Like, none of the stereotypes fit them, and yet their family has someone who experiences same-sex attraction and gender identity discordance, and it's not a broken home. It's a very loving home, where they gave them the things that they needed, but didn't spoil them. Really well-virtued parents and families, where we still see this developing. So I would hesitate to say that. I would say, though, right, there is on the part of the individual the perception of an important relationship, formative relationship. What does that mean? Throughout life, we come to these crossroads where we're forming our identity. Your 2-year-old realizes that they have autonomy and they assert it. No, I'm going to do it, right? And we encounter a crisis and we overcome it. And in doing so, the identity becomes more solidified. So like for a 2-year-old, they imitate mom and dad and how they do things. And even if they fail, pouring the milk on their cereal, they learn something about it, right? And so they overcome that crisis and they're able to be fully comfortable in being on their own without looking to mom and dad for everything. Yeah. Well, the same thing is true when we're an adolescent. And so what's going on is the individual is perceiving that the crisis that they're in, they can't make it through. It can only be overcome in this particular way, or those who are supposed to help them have abandoned them. Now, whether that's true or not, that's the perception. That I would say is common. Yeah. And it can be because of all sorts of things. Cruel kids at school, differences in personality, right? Jordan Peterson talks about agreeableness and disagreeableness. Women tend to be more agreeable. Men tend to be more disagreeable. Well, with the feminization of men over the last, 70 years, or 60 years, like, what does that look like, right? Yeah. People will say that I'm rude because I'm direct. Mm-hmm. I'm not rude. I'm not degrading you. I'm just like, you need to know this, right? And I have to work on that. I have to be careful, especially at work. But I can think of particular instances where we were trying to communicate to somebody what they needed to do, and everybody wanted to say it in these very convoluted ways because they didn't want to hurt their feelings, which was going to frustrate them and hurt their feelings more. And there's a certain disagreeableness that comes in the masculine persona, ideally, traditionally, that just kind of cuts through that and then says, all right, I know that hurt, but we had to do it, right? Yeah. Well, so coming back to that, if you have a child that's like, let's say, more agreeable, right? Because of whatever reason, maybe it's because father's a little more strict or the parents fight or whatever it is, and they want to be the peacemaker or whatever. Well, kids might take advantage of that, right? And kind of, drive them into a particular area. And then they say, oh, well, is this really who I am? What does it mean? Mm. Anyway, sorry. So there's that perceived, whether the perception of those relations not getting what they need and that somehow they're insufficient in some way. Now, whether that's real or just their perception, that's different across the spectrum.
That makes sense.
But it comes right back to that affirmation, that desire to feel loved. We all want that throughout our lives. And one could define affirmation as like that feeling you have when someone loves you for who you are and not for anything you do. Like that's a really bad way to define something according to a feeling. But like, I don't know how else to do it. Like for instance, for me, like I was at a friend's house that I knew from high school, just visiting on the way back from the annual conference because I had driven. And like his daughter comes up to me and just starts having a conversation, sharing with me her life, meaning like, the day, right? And she's like, I don't know, 5 or 6. It was just wonderful.
Yeah.
Right. Like I felt great. She didn't want me for anything other than like, because I was good. Right. Like I think little girls really recognize that, like they love to love.
Yeah.
And it's one of those great things where like to be affirmed in that way, we need that our whole lives. And if we feel that we're not getting it, even if we are, but like we feel that we're not, it's soul crushing.
Oh yeah. No,
like
I agree.
It's so painful. And that's really kind of what we're entering into with these things, is that kind of, imagine, so, you're married, you have kids, you've brought them into your identity, right? Like you don't think of yourself without thinking of your wife. You don't think of yourself without thinking of your wife and your children, right? Like that's good. I hope so, right? Like, that's how it should be. Absolutely. As a father and as a husband, or as a husband and a father. It would be like feeling that you are insufficient to provide from them, to love them, to be a husband and father to them right now. After you've already known those things, something just clicks, and now you're not worth their love. For some reason you think that, right? Like that would be the equivalent. Like I couldn't even imagine that. And I think most men, like, I think we'd curl up in a ball and cry, if that happened. So anyway, we don't need to keep talking about that, but I think that's really kind of at the crux, which goes back to the family, right? Because that's where we learn that the Father loves us, God the Father, and that there's nothing that we ever need to do to be worthy of him, because we can't ever be worthy of him. And he loves us in spite of that, He loved us into existence, knowing original sin would occur and all these other things, and that we would spit upon him and that we would sin and that we would crucify him. And he loved us into existence anyway.
Yeah. Beautiful, beautiful words, Father. We're going to have to take a quick break and we'll be right back. This is Jason Murphy for the Catholic Men's Conference of the Carolinas and the Obligation Radio Show here on the Carolina Catholic Media Network. Catholic Radio is live and on the air at AM 1270, broadcasting from Belmont, North Carolina to the Charlotte regional area. Carolina Catholic produces more local content than most Catholic radio stations across our country. Tune in on air, online, on demand, and anytime at www.carolinacatholic.org. Make sure to catch the 2022 Catholic Men's Conference of the Carolinas replays each Saturday afternoon starting at 3 p.m. You can catch Keith Nestor, Tim Staples, Dr. Ray Garundi, our own Dr. John Aquaviva, and find out what the buzz is all about for the Catholic Men's Conference of the Carolinas. Also, make sure to tune in to the featured men's shows on Carolina Catholic, Faith and Sport with Dr. John Aquaviva, airing on Mondays at 5 p.m. and on demand, The Remnant with Stephen Thomas, Bill Snyder, and Ray Haywood, airing on Saturdays at 5, and my show, The Obligation, which airs at 5 p.m. on Fridays. Catch all of these shows and more at AM 1270, on air, online, and over the app at www.carolinacatholic.org. Once again, this has been Jason Murphy. God bless, and Esto Vir.
Did you know that 90% of older adults wish to stay in their home as they age? Aging in place has many benefits. It tends to improve quality of life, which in return improves physical health. Also, retaining independence as we age is critically important to our mental health. Hi, my name is Meredith Dignan, and I am the president of Harmony Home Solutions and an active parishioner of St. Patrick Cathedral. We are your trusted partner for aging in place. We strive to enhance the lives of older adults and their families by providing premier aging in place and universal design lifestyle solutions that increase safety beautifully. Now is the time to get your aging in place plan in order with Harmony Home Solutions. Visit our website today at hhsclt.com. Again, that's hhsclt.com. Or give us a call at 980-220-8821. Again, that's 980-220-8821. We want to help you live an empowered and beautiful life.
And we're back talking to Father Colin Blatchford from Courage International, talking about the family, talking about the love of God, and being able to recognize that. And for myself, I know I've spent many years, and it's a battle sometimes, just thinking that God's waiting around the next corner with that 2x4 to knock us down. We that we're just trying to stay out of trouble, but he loves us so much. Like you said, he loved us into existence. There's nothing we can do to earn that or to change that. And sometimes it can be hard for people to accept that, and that would be difficult. That would be a tough. That would be very much a cross, not feeling unworthy and unlovable. I know that can be a temptation sometimes. Especially if you've a life of conversion. You've maybe lived a certain way for a certain time, and you've changed that way. And but the devil, he wants us to second guess. It's like going to confession and remembering that sin that maybe you forgot on accident to confess, and thinking, it's not a valid confession, and oh my gosh, I lied to God or lied to the priest, and I was dishonest. But we know that we go and when we we make a good, honest confession, and sometimes if there's something we forgot, we can certainly go back and confess that, but it's gone, it's wiped away. Our Lord is that loving. He's not there waiting to punish us. So speaking of the family, like we said, the common denominator here, the attack on the world, our society, our church, ultimately is, an attack on the family. I've got some, just a few questions. I figured, these are some that I've wondered about, and, if I figure I'll put them out there and we'll, see what you think. So when should a parent take steps to help a child who may potentially exhibit homosexual tendencies? We asked, what would be signs? Should a parent just wait? Since most kids likely would not understand what's going on inside of them, if it's, left unchecked, would that cause more confusion or seeking answers in the wrong place? You hear that a lot. I'm hearing a lot more from friends and neighbors that there's kids on our street, 3 and 4 years old, that running around in dresses and earrings, boys I'm speaking of, and wanting their names changed. I'm hearing that, maybe 7 and 8 year old kids wanting to be called a different sex. What does a parent do? What do you say to a parent who's going through some of that and just doesn't know what to do?
So part of it goes back to how we understand the world insofar as like imagination versus reality, right? Like a child that's saying that like I'm a walrus. It's like, well, like you're not a walrus, right? Like to Matt Walsh's book, right? That's the parent's job, is to actually teach them, what is reality, what is not reality, that we can have a good imagination and a fantastical life. But we also have to come back to reality. The fact that a kid can't delineate between those things is a sign of psychosexual development, right? That they can or they can't, right? So for instance, the church for First Communion is seeing if the child understands that it's not just bread, that it's something more, right? So that's the delineation between the abstract and the concrete, which the ability to imagine or think of, right? I'm using imagination in a very broad sense in that case, right? That shows a maturity, a development that they can now say, okay, so even though I can't see it, it could still be real, but it's not just make believe. It's not just play.
Yeah.
It's also reality. And the church wants to see that so that they understand what it is, who it is they're receiving, what communion means, how to prepare for it, etc. Well, the same thing is true in life, right? Like there are all times, there are times in many child's lives where like we played dress up. We had all sorts of freaking costumes. And, sometimes it was a running joke that like, oh, I'm going to be the girl, right? Like, but there's a difference between that when they're, and like declaring this is how they want to be, right? Like children need rules and parents are supposed to give them those. And statistically, and I can go find exactly where it is, but of the children who have gender identity discordance at a young age, over 90% of them grow out of it.
Yeah.
It's called they call it watching and waiting. They're not just saying, oh, well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But the child begins cognitive behavioral therapy. What are you feeling? Why, identify your emotion, identify where it's coming from. What is it that you want out of it? What are your values? How do we integrate that into it? And it's not this is been used for, well, they say it was developed in the 60s, and it was, but the church has been using it in the context of spiritual direction since the very beginning. There's saints that have written like in the same terms, taking your thoughts and feelings and desires and integrating them with reality, with reason, and during that same time, there's a very important aspect of like family therapy where the parents are learning, well, part of this could develop, there's many reasons where it can come from, but it could be coming from the child is feeling that the rules are unclear, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what the roles are in my family. I don't know what gender is, like the gender roles and masculinity and femininity are unclear to me. Now that could be real or perceived yet again, right? It could also be these things are talked about in television, YouTube videos, classrooms down to kindergarten and pre-K, in any public school and in most Catholic schools and private schools. It's talked about by their friends. It's talked about by their friends' parents. It's all over the internet.
Yeah.
So if they have a phone, they've been exposed to it. Like
television commercials, Disney movies.
Yeah. I mean, and like not just like it's mentioned, but like it's insidiously presented to them as a real option. Like for my psychology classes, I had to watch the commercials on Saturday morning cartoons and figure out who the demographic was that it was it was for. And I'm watching this little kiddie show, I don't know, maybe for 6 to 7 years old. And it comes out, they have these dolls that are clearly being presented to them. And the dolls are dressed like and look like what you might think of as like a stereotypical hooker costume, like in the 80s or 90s, like in a movie, like Pretty Woman, something like that. That's how they're dressed, and their makeup is done, and like, well, that's not being demographically appealed to for boys. No, it's little girls saying you're a sex object. Like, okay, this is 5 and 6 year olds. Yeah, is it any wonder why they believe that when they're 7, 8, and 9?
Absolutely.
And that's just one of many things, And so a lot of it needs to come from the parents talking freely about these things, talking about the story that, what is your story insofar as like, we write our own story. We write, we create our identity, but we do so according to the values that we find most important and the meaning that we receive from experiences of good, healthy relationships. Yeah. And so if a child is having those questions, it's important for us to do everything we can to make sure that they have good, healthy relationships. And it's true. And some may still have those questions, and that's fine, right? We want to point them to the truth. We want to make things clear. And as parents, we are able to guide, and to teach in a way that's loving and kind and yet very clear and firm,
there's this whole idea of just not just to affect the family, but to really just destroy the whole idea of what family is. I've heard, many months ago, there was a school board somewhere, and they were, talking to, maybe it had to do with, critical race theory, or maybe it had to do with, some studies, sexual studies, or whatever. And the board member said, parents just need to get over the idea of their kids. They're our kids. And that was just really scary. Because, that goes along with, my wife just pointed out that our Charlotte Mecklenburg school system has a gender identity disclosure form that kids, I don't know what age group this starts at, but maybe it's middle school, maybe middle school. Basically saying, this is something that we won't reveal to your parents. This is just for us, so we know how to identify you. And they go into all these details, and, so that they can pretty much destroy that there's any, bond between the parents. Like, you can trust us. We're here for whatever. And, it's don't worry about, your parents aren't going to find out. And it's a full-fledged attack on not just attacking the family, just to destroy the family completely. The whole idea.
I mean, think about how it would come off that a 9 or 10-year-old, right, is told, oh, you can't trust your mother, right? A little girl who's just going into adolescence, you can't trust your mother. You can't trust your father. They hate you. They don't want you to succeed, right? Like, it's so ridiculous. And yet, there's this myth of the world that says, well, I don't need anybody else for my happiness. I can form my own identity from myself. Like, I don't need anybody else. I can do it from my own experiences. And of all experiences, emotional experiences are the most important, and strong emotional experiences are always sexual experiences or sexual feelings. And so I have to respond to those. And if I don't, or anybody tries to stop me, they're keeping me from being my authentic self and being happy, and they hate me. Yeah. Which, like, it completely removes society and religion and values from the role they're supposed to play, unless they're affirmative of these other identities. And then it's okay for them to have input. Yeah. Right. But, like, not if it's what was, normal until 5 seconds ago, 15 years ago.
That's right. Yeah, it's a struggle. I mean, it really is. We limit, we limit the technology in our house. Our kids don't have cell phones, and, always, all the way up to my 14-year-old, we still haven't done that. We still haven't gone down that road. So we limit, we don't have the free access to the internet and iPads and all that. But I was just watching, and I was joking with them the other night, because they've got a few, kind of funny movies, Sonic the Hedgehog or Hotel Transylvania, pretty innocent in and of themselves. But they quote these movies, these shows all the time. And it's funny. They'll joke and they'll just, have these quotes. And I'm like, I said to my wife, I said, even with the very limited amount of technology exposure, they still memorize these, and they're seemingly harmless. But, imagine if they had full range to just all of that stuff. Their brains are just they're just absorbing everything. They can sit there and memorize and quote all these movies, let alone if we had just a free flow of information. I mean, you can just sit there. My oldest, he likes to watch HGTV and some of these house flipping shows, but the amount of agenda that's pushed during, especially the commercials and even the shows themselves, the premise of many of the shows, it just heaps it upon anyone watching. And you would think that would be a harmless, show to watch, something about construction or updating and renovating houses. And even that, there's so much there. So we're really careful, but the temptation is, it's all over. I mean, commercials these days, it's like almost, if you don't see a commercial with a same-sex partner in it, then it's just a rarity for something to be broadcast. If you're watching just a regular broadcast, television show or something. But I had another question here. Another question we had. Let's see. So, as in regards to trans individuals, if they have a desire to live a chaste life according to the gospel, how does the ability to continue to dress in the opposite, sex clothing? I mean, how would you, work with that kind of situation?
Ooh. So someone who's experiencing gender identity discordance. Okay. there's a lot of things that go into this, insofar as, we're talking about someone who's older, who transitioned later in life. Is this, we had someone in our parish who, they were probably born in the late 70s, and they didn't do genetic testing when they had like Klinefelters or hermaphroditism, one of these sort of malformations or of the sexual organs or something like that. And so they would just pick one, right? And the person, was living as a female, but was biologically male, but that's how they lived their entire lives.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until they were in their 20s that they had to go to the doctor for something that they got some sort of a blood or genetic test done, where they were like the doctor asked them because they clearly didn't understand or what have you. And they're like, oh, really? Well, what do you do in that sense, right? So the church is always going to try, we have to tell the truth, but there's also a place in which we're in the middle of a mess and we're trying to function with life, right? So the person who's divorced and remarried, the church says, well, the ideal is you separate from this person and you live in separate houses. Mm-hmm. Well, we have children. The children don't understand. What do we do? You can abstain from communion, obviously. Depending on, in some cases, maybe they live in a place where the people don't actually know them from before they were divorced and remarried. Maybe it happened when they were very young and it was just one of the spouses, They may decide to live as brother and sister, so the internal scandal is gone and there's no external scandal because they're living as married and nobody knows that. And, the church would invite, at that point, if they've made that commitment, the church allows them to go to communion. So it's not a lie. It's also internal form. I've not been in that situation. With the individual I was talking about, we didn't make, he came and told us, she came and told us, and was like, hey, I found this out. What do I do? And it's like, well, I don't really know. And so we had some more conversation about it. And it wasn't about cross-dressing for a fetishism. Yeah. Right. And we have to remember, clothing is very cultural, right? So me putting a kilt on is in no way feminine. Right. But it would be kind of weird because I'm not Scottish. Well, I am Scotch-Irish, but we're not super close to that. But I wear a cassock, which looks like a dress, right? Sure. But culturally, that's acceptable, right? Now, that's not to say that everything is relative, but it is changeable, right? Culture is changeable when it comes to clothing. So the question would be why are you doing this, right? Mm-hmm. If you need to do this to continue to get a sexual thrill, an arousal thrill, the church would say, well, you're doing something for the purposes of arousing yourself, and that's wrong. Absolutely. That's a disordered action, intrinsically disordered, because you're trying to take sexual pleasure outside the story of what God intended it for, the purpose God intended it for, which was for procreation. And then we can talk about some of the other things that might go with that. But that idea of that focus on the fetishism, we would say, well, you can't do that. Right? That makes sense. Now, the person who, let's say, has realized the error of their ways and has said, but I can't afford to detransition. And this is what I look like. And so this is how I'm going to live. And I'm not going to share with everybody, these things where I've been. I don't think the church would necessarily have a problem with that, because it's not your job to share all your dirty laundry, as it were. Sure. Right. And there are many reasons why things happen, and we don't always disclose all of the reasons and the truth behind them to people if it's not entitled to them. Now, obviously, if they're trying to push an agenda, or they're not living out the church's teaching, or they're saying it's okay and acceptable that I did that, that's all different stuff. We're not talking about that. Okay? Yeah. Someone who's truly trying to live out the church's teaching, it may cause less scandal and harm for them to continue in this vein than it would be for them to constantly declare the opposite, because people might actually become scandalized. Well, then why are we even letting them in? Which of course doesn't make sense. We should let everybody in. But, right, which is, I'm not going to tell them how to live their lives just to make other people, right, feel okay. But there is a place to say, okay, like, what is it that you're comfortable with? And given the circumstances you're in, and it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
Does that kind of help?
Yeah.
Sorry,
No,
that was a long answer, but
no, it's just, it's things that, we don't really think about, and things that aren't asked. And, I'm sitting here, while we're talking, I'm thinking of Caitlyn Jenner, very conservative principles, especially, at least politically, what if, she, decided, hey, I want to, I want to join the Catholic Church and I want to, live a chaste life. But then I guess you'd have to look at it like you look at a politician or anybody that's in the public eye. Or is it causing scandal, and what's the need for it? So that makes sense. If it's a fetish of dressing up that way, that seems like that should kind of manifest itself as someone would grow in understanding of the faith.
Sure, which it's not always. I'm not saying it always is.
Yeah.
That was just an example I was using.
No.
So we have to be careful.
This is all new kind of for me too. So I'm just kind of bouncing around thoughts in my own head. So yeah, no, it's interesting. It sounds very, very crazy, but these are real questions, and these are especially from a ministerial, position that, you're in, just the type of things that you'll run into.
Well, and I should qualify, like, everything that I'm saying is, like, to the best of my knowledge. Like, I'm
sure.
Yes, I do this a lot. Like, I have these conversations, but I don't have rules that I follow when someone comes in, other than the magisterial teachings of the church, right? I don't say like we have another question on here about bringing same-sex partners to holidays, dinners, and weddings. Right. Like, we don't have a rule for that. That's a direct rule, because it's different, right? Like, absolutely. Like, if you have a bunch of small children at home, you might have different rules for them than if you don't, right? Because two adults who are the parents of one of them, right? Like if you and your kids had moved off, and one of them is bringing their partner over and, like, saying, okay, you gotta have separate rooms. Like, otherwise we don't care. Like, because we know what our faith is. We don't find scandal in it, right? Like, we do, but, like, it's not gonna rock us. We're not at a place that's formative in our lives where we're gonna go, well, but I don't understand, right? Whereas a 5 or 6 or 7 or 9-year-old, they're not gonna understand, right? Yeah.
That's right.
And so we don't ever want to make just hard, fast rules. I think this is something that, so naturally what we do is we use labels. And this is an interesting kind of thought thing, right? So like, we talk about the LGBTQ plus labels. We talk about all sorts of other labels. What are labels? Well, our perception, as I said before, is connected to values, right? Value perception. Labels are self-ascribed values that we use to categorize things. Now, we do that to categorize ourselves. I'm in this group, not that group, etc. We also do it to others. Yes. You're in the married people group, I'm not, right? Like, and so we use those to sort in a very rapid way when we're walking down the street everything that we're interacting with, right? Everything that we're seeing is focusing on the value of it and immediately dismissing it or focusing on it for us to stay alive and function and walk and all these things. So keeping that in mind, that's how the mind works. Then when we start talking about labels in this context, we're talking about things where these are the meanings that people have ascribed to themselves. Well, it's okay to have those labels and to use them to put people in groups, right? But we also have to be open to changing those, right? Yeah. Like, my interaction with different ethnicities living on the outskirts of Detroit and going into the bad areas of Detroit, right, should not be applied to going and hanging out, like being in relationship with minorities in, like, Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I shouldn't even say minorities is, like, too big, right? Like, individual areas and perceptions and, like, the values I ascribe to the people that I met in a particular area in Detroit, where houses are, like, totally looking bombed out and falling down, and the fire department doesn't come and answer the fire calls, and the police won't come in because they get shot, right? Like my labels for that are very different than my labels in Chattanooga. And even when I'm there in Detroit, right, like, what I'm using the labels for the dangerous areas, let's say, I still have to be open to being wrong and changing those labels.
Right.
And I think, very often we get accused of saying, well, you're just cutting them off. You're using that label to dismiss them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have to be careful about that as Catholics. And I think that we have a habit of doing that in the modern world. We hear of someone who has same-sex attraction or somebody who has gender identity discordance. And like, there's a desire to say, oh, well, that's very not me. And like, especially I think of, let us say, like more practicing Catholics. Like, oh, that's a sin that cries out to heaven. That's true. That's absolutely true. But then again, all sin is sin, right? And all of it leads to death. And so how abhorred are we? How resistant are we to other sin, right? It also says that the cries of the widows and orphans and those who don't get a just wage cry out to heaven. How often do we go to Walmart?
Yeah.
I used to work at Walmart. They don't pay a just wage. I'm here to tell you.
Mm.
They don't treat their employees well. How many times do we go to Walmart? How many times do we go to Amazon? Does Amazon pay their employees well? Are they looking out for the best of their employees, or are they using them as a means to an end? Like,
right.
And even in doing so, are they giving a just wage? How many places do we like? And are we so resistant? Are we so vocal about those things? I'm not saying that because we're not there, we can't be in this arena. What I'm saying is we need to come to an integration of all those things and recognize that, look, we're all sinners. We all make mistakes and we've all got problems. And God forbid I should ever have a problem with that, because I would be far worse than any of these people. Far worse. Way worse.
Sure.
Right? Like, that's where we need to be.
That's right.
And Chesterton talks about that. But
no, that's great. Well, Father, I know we're coming up on time. You've got to run out, I know, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. It's always very interesting, very informative. We never, ever cover everything we need to cover, and I know we'll be back again, and I always appreciate you being here with us on The Obligation. If folks want to find out more about Courage International, and have any questions, I guess they can reach you on your website, Father. That's couragerc.org.
That's correct. Or and the office number is on there, and if they call the office number, they can get a hold of me, Father Bachansky, or Angelo Sabella, who's he's our coordinator of relationship. He makes sure that everybody's questions are getting answered and needs are being met to the best of our abilities. So don't ever hesitate to call us or email us or reach out. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, we appreciate it, Father, and thank you for the good work you're doing in the church, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
All right. Thank you,
All right, God bless, Father.